My name is Kai Lin, and I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Criminal Justice at Cal State University, Sacramento. As Cherry mentioned, I am a sociologist and criminologist, and my research is mainly focused on the etiology of interpersonal violence, and that includes intimate partner violence, but also more severe forms of interpersonal violence like homicide. I've published research in this area, as well as criminal justice responses to interpersonal violence. And specifically today, I'm going to present to you my collaborated research along with Dr. Wang Xing at Beijing Normal University, Dr. Ivan Sun at University of Delaware, and Dr. Wu Yuning at Wayne State University. So this is the title of our published paper, Chinese Police Officers' Attitude Towards Domestic Violence Intervention. And specifically, we're using empirical data to examine whether training and knowledge of the recently enacted domestic violence law, whether that has an impact on police officers' attitudes towards intervening into domestic violence. My agenda today is to present to you first, very briefly, some background information about domestic violence in China and the social background leading up to the anti-DV law in China. Then I will present sort of some empirical evidence that we've gathered that have been published so far on the implementation of the anti-DV law. And then I will introduce the research design and the findings from our current study. And finally, I will offer a couple of policy and advocacy implications that issue from the findings of this study. So I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with, the topic of domestic violence in China, but just to recapitulate a little bit, there has been a lot of empirical research done to assess the prevalence of domestic violence in China. However, the numbers that we get from this research regarding prevalence really varies very widely. So a recent meta-analysis, which is basically a critical synthesis and review of all the published empirical study. This meta-analysis was published in 2019, and it found that the prevalence, the lifetime prevalence for psychological research in China ranges 17.4 to 24.5%. And for physical violence, it's about 2.5 to 5.5%. And for sexual violence, that's a little bit lower, between 0.3 to 1.7%. So at first glance, these numbers don't strike you as, indicative of a very serious problem of domestic violence. However, if we look at other population-specific research, it tends to tell a different story. For example, this other recent study that was published in 2020 surveyed over 3,000 individuals in mainland China, mainly through Weibo and Weixin. So these are snowball samples that were initiated on this social media platform. So as we all know, Weibo and Weixin users are, first and foremost, they have access to the internet and they have access to smart devices and they use social media. So, there's a larger representation of the, urban middle-class population in China. That population is overrepresented in all online surveys, especially those involving social media. So from this study, over 3,000 respondents, we found that there were 488 women who identify as heterosexual, reported having experienced domestic violence in the past year. So the figure from the first bullet point was lifetime prevalence, but this one is just from the last year. And there's 14.6% of the 3,000 plus that were surveyed reported having experienced domestic violence. Moreover, over 2/3 of the survivor never sought help of any sort regarding their victimization. And in the remaining quarter of the survivors who did seek help, they primarily sought help from their friends and family. Very, very few actually went to the police or other professional services for help. So that sort of paints a general picture about the prevalence and the severity of domestic violence in China, especially in the urban area among the more educated, more affluent urban population that have access to the internet. Now, there are many causes of domestic violence, and actually in domestic violence research, researchers tend to speak of risk factors rather than causes, because domestic violence researchers tend to treat domestic violence as a social ill, as a public health problem to some extent. So we know in the health literature, we talk about risk factors and not just a singular cause. It's probabilistic rather than, deterministic. So there are many factors that increase the odds or probability of someone perpetrating or experiencing domestic violence. And these include social and economic strains, for example, unemployment, poverty, social isolation, ostracization, conflict, in a social setting, substance abuse, use and abuse, and that includes alcohol and drugs. And another prominent factor is gender role ideology. So more traditional gender roles that many in developing countries hold tend to increase the odds of both experiencing and perpetrating domestic violence. In addition, there are two factors that are quite special, unique to the Chinese population, and they are in-law conflicts, which was research promoted by Dr. Chan here in Hong Kong. She did a lot of research on in-law conflicts in Hong Kong. And also another very prominent risk factor that is present in many Asian populations, which is gambling. So in the West, you have a stronger predictive effect from things like drugs and alcohol, but in the Asian population, gambling is just as predictive of a factor. So those are some of the common risk factors. Chinese people and the population in the West generally hold very different views about domestic violence, although we see here that there are many shared risk factors. But what we should do about domestic violence, the two populations share very different views. So this research that was conducted in 2011, so it's a little bit dated, but I think it still the patterns still hold true for the most part. So this was a survey conducted among American and Chinese college students. So these are all college students from research universities who are very similar in terms of their educational levels, cognitive development, so on and so forth. And of course, they're young adults, so they're relatively have the same sort of exposure to these social issues. So this survey revealed that most U.S. college students believe that domestic violence intervention is an important part of police work. And this is to be contrasted with their Chinese counterparts. Only less than half of them view domestic violence as an important part of police work. Over 90% of U.S. college students view arresting DV offenders as a good policy. This is to be contrasted with only 42% of their Chinese counterparts. And the list goes on here. And most notably, 91% of American college students believe that domestic violence should be considered a crime versus only 72% of the Chinese college students. Now, again, this was conducted in 2011, so a lot, has changed in the past decade. Still, this gives you a flavor of, the sort of the disparity in sort of conceptualizing domestic violence and the police role in the involvement of police in domestic violence between the East and the West, so to speak. So against this backdrop, a lot had happened since 2011 when this research was published, right? So the social awareness in China around the issue of domestic violence has evolved over time, and this culminated in this anti-DV law legislation that was first introduced and passed the National People's Congress in 2015, December 2015, and came into effect the following year in 2016, March of 2016. And notably, the law introduced China's first statutory definition of domestic violence. So according to this definition, domestic violence is the inflicting of physical, psychological, or other harm by a family member on another by beating, bondage, injury, restraint, and forcible limits on personal freedom, recurring verbal abuse, threats, and other means. This is according to Article 2 of the anti-DV law. It also declares that the state, the Chinese state, that the Chinese government prohibits any form of domestic violence. Of course, this is a very sort of a vague and general statement. Nevertheless, it was in the law. More importantly, the law calls for the police to deploy forces in a timely fashion upon receiving reports of domestic violence. So in other words, this sort of gives the legal mandate for police to be more proactive in domestic violence enforcement. You can also notice this definition of domestic violence is pretty broad and gives us a sort of if we were to compare this definition to one that exists in any sort of Western legal code, we can say that this actually represents one of the most progressive form of legal definition, because it includes not only physical abuse, but also psychological abuse, even recurring verbal abuse and threats, intimidation, limits on personal freedom, right? So this definition in and of itself, it represents the results of our latest understanding of domestic violence. So that's something to be celebrated, and it was celebrated, right, by many people when the law first came out in 2015, 2016. However, as time went by and the law was put into practice, more criticisms came forward against the law. And one of the main criticisms is that the law overly emphasized the role of informal mediation in the quote-unquote prevention of DV. So in the prevention of domestic violence, the Chinese authority was really referring to some informal mechanisms that exist perhaps in the neighborhood association, right, in Jiweihui, or in other private mediation organizations that may provide basically some sort of counseling to couples before the situation devolves. But furthermore, the law really called for the police. It called for law enforcement to also use mediation in their enforcement of domestic violence. So whenever a victim reports a domestic violence incident, the police were encouraged to also give an informal mediation between the victim and the offender. So not only from these private parties, but also from official social control, which is law enforcement. And even if sanctions were to be issued against the offender, the law favors informal sanctions, such as verbal and written warnings over arrest or sort of public order detention, right? 行政拘留, which we know is possible in China for up to 14 days. But even that was not encouraged in the anti-DV law. So as a result, one of the most prominent criticism of the law is that it does not guarantee victim safety as it sort of promised in the beginning of the law. Sort of, it has this facade of trying to protect women's rights, especially victims' rights. But, if you take it together, if you take it as a whole, it doesn't really have any sort of force behind this guarantee. And finally, one of the innovation of the law, which was the restraining order, was also criticized for not being able to provide protection for the victims because the police are reluctant to enforce in the first place, and that results in difficulty in gathering evidence. So if the police goes in and they don't arrest anyone, it is really, really hard to hold in court that there was actual harm or injury going on that would warrant some sort of a restraining order. So all of these parts go together, and the lack of police enforcement rests at the core of it. So let's look at some actual empirical data regarding how the Chinese police responded to domestic violence after the implementation of the anti-DV law. So this was a study published in 2018. It examined domestic violence cases in the city of Shenzhen, which we know is one of the largest and most wealthy cities in China. It also represents one of the more progressive cities in China, if you will. So during this time period between April 2016, which is a month after the enactment of the anti-DV law, and January 2018, there were almost 9,000 domestic violence cases. Only 3.1% of them, which is 283 cases, the offenders in those cases were issued written warnings. Only half of a percent of those cases, which is 49 in total, received public disorder sanctions. So these are perhaps some short, imprisonment or up to 14 days, as we mentioned earlier. 0.3% of them, which is 27 in total, were criminally charged. The majority of the cases, 43.6% of them that received any sort of sanction, they received mediation. And you may ask, what about the rest of the 50%? They were dismissed. So the rest of the 50% of the cases were simply dismissed. Among those that were not dismissed, 43.6, so the vast majority of them received mediation versus a tiny fraction that received any other kind of sanction, ranging from written warning to being criminally charged, but less than 1% were either criminally charged or received public disorder sanction, being jailed for less than 14 days. So that's less than 1%. And this is, certainly not what we were hoping for. And this kind of lax enforcement of domestic violence was called into question when, unfortunately, only when certain high-profile cases were reported by the media. For example, I think many of us have heard of this case, which was the case of Lamu, who was a very famous live streamer on Douyin, which is a Chinese version of TikTok. And because of her celebrity status and, of course, how brutal this case was, it got a lot of media coverage. Some facts from this case, I'm not going to go into the entire case, but some facts from this case do resonate with the statistics that we've just seen. For example, in this news report, it says that Lamu called the police at least twice after the March attack. So there was an attack from her then husband, but each time they refused to intervene. The police said it was our family matter and didn't do anything about it. They came to take a look and left. This is very typical, right? As I mentioned on the previous slide, half of those cases were just dismissed outright. But, Lamu actually reached out to the police multiple times for different reasons. So the second quote that I got from the news report, it was during this time that Tang, which was the ex-husband, looking for his wife, so they hadn't divorced at the time yet, entered the souvenir shop where Doma, who was Lamu's sister. So Doma worked in the souvenir shop. Tang went into it and punched the sister, fracturing her face. She was hospitalized while Tang was called briefly into the police station and walked out a free man. So he did not receive any sanction. This is another quote. Our relatives went to the police station and asked officers to do something about this man, Doma said. We told them someone could be killed if it continued like this, but they didn't take it seriously. I don't know what the police were thinking. So there's a pattern here. And of course, Lamu lived in a small town in an underdeveloped province. So things are a little bit different between that and Shenzhen. But we can sort of gather how the standard response from the police is or is supposed to be in China regarding domestic violence. So just to give you guys a little bit of a point of contrast, I here have some data from the US and the UK regarding domestic violence arrest. In the US, for example, for all non-fatal domestic violence victimization occurring between 2006 and 2015, US police arrested an offender during their initial response in 23% of those reported victimizations. In other words, 23% of the time, almost a quarter of the time, the police arrest someone in their initial response to a domestic violence call. So that's almost a quarter of the time. In the UK, official statistics show that the domestic abuse arrest rate in England and Wales registered around 45 arrests per 100 domestic violence abuse-related offenses in the 12 months prior to June 30th, 2017. So that's 45% of those domestic violence cases resulted in an arrest. That's 45% and 23%. If we go back to the slide on Shenzhen, if you remember, it was less than 1% that were either criminally charged or, received public disorder sanctions. So that's a big gap between that, less than 1% and 23% in the US and 45% in the UK. In addition to these statistics, like those that we saw in Shenzhen, studies that were also conducted after the enactment of the DV law, anti-DV law, to look at whether officers' attitudes have changed. And they did not really find significant changes in these two studies, one by Zhao and colleagues in 2018 and the other by Wang and colleagues in 2019. Another study that looked at trainings on the DV law that takes place in police academies. So these are police cadets who are training to be officers, and they were trained on topics such as the new law. The researchers found no significant association between their knowledge of the law and their attitudes towards domestic violence. So either the trainings were not good enough or that they just didn't make an impression on the young cadets. For our study, there was no study that specifically looks at whether the training and knowledge of the law had any effect on frontline officers' attitudes towards DV intervention. So there's a difference between, police cadets who have zero experience enforcing the law versus, frontline officers who apparently have all sorts of enforcement experience, including enforcing domestic violence cases. So we were specifically looking at whether training and knowledge of the law has an impact on these frontline officers who have actual enforcement experience. So that was our main research question. And we used survey data to help us answer that question. So our survey data was gathered from police officers in the province of Jiangsu, China. And as you are familiar with, Jiangsu is one of the most developed province in eastern China. So bear that in mind as we look at the results. In Jiangsu, the data collection was coordinated and conducted by local officers and police administrators who are acquaintances of the researchers, in particular, Dr. Wang Xing at Beijing Normal University. So thanks to her, we had connections to these police chiefs and administrators, and they allowed us access to the officers in their bureaus, in their departments, and we were able to distribute paper surveys to officers in 2 cities of the province of Jiangsu. So we utilized a convenience sample. So we were only able to survey the officers who happened to be there when we were distributing the survey. We informed them of the anonymous and voluntary nature of the research. It has nothing to do with their promotion, with their evaluation, nothing of the sort. So they knew that there was no risk involved and that only the researcher would look at the data. And of course, it was anonymous, so there was no risk of, them fearing that there may be any sort of monitoring or retaliation. So in one of the 2 cities, a total of 500 officers in 15 field stations, which are 派出所, were given the survey by project coordinators, and 423 officers returned the survey. To diversify our samples, in the second city, we distributed 300 surveys to 4 police stations, so 分局 rather than 派出所. So 派出所 are located on the street level, the 街道 level. 分局 are usually a municipal level unit. So some of these officers may not be as frontline as those in the 派出所. But nevertheless, we wanted to diversify the sample. So we got 300 back. So we had a response rate of about 90% from the 2 cities. After excluding the unusable surveys as well as missing cases, our final sample had 323 cases, and we performed analysis with these 323 cases. Specifically, we use a technique called path analysis. It's a kind of technique that's very much like regression analysis, but it allows you to estimate the coefficients of all the variables at once. I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'm happy to entertain questions about the methodology in the Q&A section. So this is our sample. We had about 74% male officers. The average age of those who were in the final sample was about 34. And 70% of them had a bachelor's degrees and above. 22% of them, they were unmarried, meaning that they were either divorced or single. And 86% of them experienced policing DV. 60% of them said that their unit had clear regulations for handling DV. And 76% of them said that their unit trained frontline officers on domestic violence. So we asked them their attitudes towards intervening into domestic violence as a police officer. We asked them 3 sets of attitudes, and we named these 3 sets of attitudes as minimal police involvement, policing DV important task, and pro-arrest. So in the first variable, minimal police involvement, we asked the respondents whether they agree or strongly agree that police involvement is unhelpful in DV, whether police arrival heightens tensions between the victim and the offender, whether responding to DV actually detracts from important functions of the police, which is crime or crime prevention, and whether DV should be handled by social workers or other social service providers. And these are the percentages of those who either agree or strongly agree. Okay, so as you can see, a lot of them didn't see the police as sort of a legitimate, has a legitimate role to play in DV. And the second set of questions are about whether policing DV is an important task. Here you see something a little bit more ambiguous. So there are 61% of them who agree or strongly disagree that responding to DV is an important part of police work. So I don't know if they were, seriously meaning this, or it was just a cognitive dissonance on their part, because it seems that these two could be interpreted as somewhat contradictory. But you also see that 77% of them say that police officers should be sympathetic and understanding, and that it is the police officer's responsibility to refer victims to sources of help. But a lot of them, the vast majority of them, did not believe that arresting offender can resolve DV. As you can see, half of them say that police should arrest abuser despite victim wishes, or that arresting DV is a good policy. It's significantly lower than the other 2 sets of attitudes. 45% of them said that they received training about the new law, and 67% of them said that they were at least somewhat familiar with the new law. Okay, so we perform path analysis using these variables. So the background statistics, background characteristics predicts whether one has a higher or lower level of the law, whether one chooses to receive training on the law or not. And we also believe that it directly predicts their attitude towards DV. We also believe organizational support is an important factor, especially in China, when the hierarchy in the police unit is very clear. The 上级 or 领导 have a lot more authority over frontline officers than they otherwise would in the US. Even in the US, there is a very clear hierarchy in police departments. So we believe that organizational support, especially those that are promoted by their chiefs, are going to have a strong impact on whether they get the knowledge and training, and directly on whether they have some sort of attitude towards, some punitive attitudes towards DV offense. We also believe that knowledge and training of the law should ideally have an impact on their attitudes. So we tested this on our first set of attitude, which is minimum police involvement. And we saw that, first of all, although training on the DV law does seem to reduce this belief in minimal police involvement, their knowledge actually increases this belief in minimal involvement. And of course, several of the demographic variable also has an influence. the more educated you are, the more you tend to believe that the police should stay out rather than getting involved. And those who are married tend to believe that the police should stay out rather than getting involved. And those with training and with DV experience, however, do believe that police should play a bigger role. But by and large, the effects are kind of mixed in this one. Here, we see that in the second set of attitudes, domestic violence intervention and important police task, we see that policing DV experience and most strongly organizational support from their unit most strongly predicts DV intervention, whether they believe it is an important police task. And of course, anti-DV law knowledge does promote that as well, but not the training directly itself, although the training does increase one's level of knowledge. So you can say that there is an indirect effect from the training. Now, I think the most important part of this research is this represented in this diagram. We're looking at the pro-arrest attitude. And here you can clearly see that neither training nor knowledge of the law has any impact on pro-arrest attitude. Again, the strongest effect comes from organizational support. So the attitude of their unit, the attitude of their chiefs, whether they have clear regulations or not that are already in place. Policing DV experience actually reduces pro-arrest attitude. So this is an interesting one, and we can talk about this, a little bit more. I think this reflects how the police was policing DV in the past, and that experience sort of carries over as you advance in the police system, and you sort of absorb that over time that you should stay out of it. So this may as well represent sort of the old mentality that still pervades police units in China. And of course, we see that old officers tend to be more pro-arrest rather than young officers. So this is actually in the opposite direction as the U.S. In the U.S., the younger officers tend to be more aggressive in enforcing this. But I think the young officers in China are sort of laying low. They don't want to be the person who's doing all of this aggressive stuff. So they want to lay low. They want to be able to get promoted first before they do something a little bit more assertive, like arresting DV offenders. If we take this together, training and knowledge of law has marginal effect on police attitudes. Some effect, but marginal. The effect on pro-arrest attitude is almost non-existent. Organizational support seems to cast the greatest influence on officer pro-arrest attitude. And I think the reason why we're seeing this finding is because the two contradicting imperatives of the law were always there. Maintaining family harmony on the one hand, informal mediation through prevention of domestic violence, and protection of victims through, declaring, the domestic violence is to be prohibited. I think those two sentiments are in contradiction with one another in the law. And it was very, very palpable for law enforcement officers as they interpret the law. Okay, so I would just say a couple of policy and advocacy implications. So I think the most critical barrier to the implementation of more protective measures is a lack of clear legal mandate. The law is self-contradictory. It promotes family harmony on the one hand and victim, protection on the other, and they're not integrated or reconciled with one another. In the US, arrest is either mandatory, encouraged, preferred, or at the officer's discretion. So there was, plenty of legal mandate. It was probably, in their evaluation system. Now, there's a lot of criticism of mandatory arrest and arrest in general when it comes to domestic violence. That's emerging from Western research. So there's a lot of criticism of this policy in Western research. And I'm not saying that there's no problem that comes with arresting domestic violence offenders. Some research indicates that it actually puts the victim at risk and could escalate tension to a point of homicide when the police is involved. Or that it could just, for whatever reason, actually contributes to long-term mortality of the victims. So, there was one study that tracked the victims for 27 years, and they found out that those who had called the police and had the police involved, their mortality rates were higher. So, research on this is mixed, and I'm not saying that arrest is good, but I think there's a lot of policy room for China to be more forceful and be more clear in its legal mandate to arrest those that are clearly, injuring their partners. And the second point is that we should respect women's rights to divorce, especially in the presence of DV. So there's recent research coming from my friend, Dr. Ethan Michelson at Indiana University. His research revealed that only 20% of court-adjudicated divorce petitions are granted by local courts at first attempt. So most of these cases need to be submitted to the court twice before the court would grant them. And we know that during that time, a lot of abuse can happen. Even in the presence of visible domestic violence, courts are reluctant to grant divorce at the first attempt. So that is a big problem, because by forcing the couples to stay together a little bit longer than they want to, you are forcing the women, especially in these instances, to subject them to greater harm. So I just wanted to promote this book by my friend, Dr. Ethan Michelson, about China's divorce courts. It's a brilliant book. He made it completely free. So it's published by Cambridge University Press, and it's completely free. And I will drop the link in the chat. You can just access it. It's completely open access. So you can just access it at your leisure. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for listening.